Alright, so in this video we're going to take a look at how to start creating buttons in our applications. We're also going to discuss the concept of events. So this is going to be what happens whenever we click one of these buttons. It's going to trigger one of these events. So we're going to go ahead and discuss a little bit about this as well, so we understand this process of capturing those events and then doing something with them. So to start off with, we've got this initial construction of a button object, so a button control that we're going to put into our application. So this is essentially just the visible element that we'll be able to see in that GUI in the interface itself. But in order to add some action to that button click, we need to also add an event handler to our scene. So an event is going to be any action that takes place while the program is running. So typically with events, these are going to be things that the user will do. So that includes things like a mouse click. In other cases, you might do things like if the user mouses over a particular element, the hover effect. Maybe if they click and drag, that could be another type of event. So the primary one we're going to be focusing on here with buttons is just a click event. So this is going to be a type of action event. So we can see for our event source, that's going to be the control that event originates from. That event source is going to construct an event object. So in addition to our button object, we also have an event object. For buttons, this object is going to be an instance of the action event class. The event handler is going to be another object that responds to those events. And event firing is going to be the process of that event handler handling an event object passed to it. So we've got three types of objects we're dealing with here. We've got the actual button object, so just the element in our GUI. We've got the action event, so that's going to be the thing that the user is doing, so it's going to generate an object. And then we've got our event handler, so that's going to be where we actually determine what action to take when that action event occurs. So to take a look at this event handler code, we've got this following example here where we have an event handler that's going to handle an action event object. This will have one method inside of it that we need to go ahead and implement. So when we deal with the event handler, you'll notice in the header for this class, we're saying private class, and then we give this any name that we want, and we say implements event handler, and then specifically the event handler on action events. So that implements keyword, I will come back to that in much more detail a little bit later. The primary thing that I want to say about event handler for now, because of the fact that we're using that implements keyword, there's one thing that tells us about event handler, which is that is an interface. In this case, it's going to be an interface that has just one single method that we need to go ahead and implement, as the keyword implements would imply. So we're going to go ahead and give this handle method some kind of behavior. So it's not terribly different from whenever we use extends application for the overall JavaFX application, and how we have to implement the start method. So there's a very similar behavior going on there. So we're going to go ahead and implement this handle event. We'll specify the event source, so that's going to be that action event event. And then we're going to go ahead and, in the body of that handle method, fill in some code for handling the event that's being passed in. So to get started on this, we'll go ahead and minimize this. I'm going to come over here, and we're going to go ahead and create a new project. And for this project, what we're going to be doing is, to start off with, I'll do a very simple case where we're going to have a label, so with some content inside of it, and we're going to push a button, and it's going to change the content in that label. We'll then go ahead and modify this further to introduce images. So we'll do the same thing with an image. We have one image view that's being displayed initially. We'll then go ahead and change that when the button is clicked. We'll then, from there, move into something a little bit more complex, where instead of clicking the button just to change the image from one to the other, we will also introduce an input, another piece of input from the user with a text field. So they'll be able to type something in and then push the button. So I use that to kind of modify the behavior slightly, still just kind of displaying those images depending on what the user types into that text field. And then to start kind of wrapping this up, I'll go into a few additional ways we can implement that button, the event handler for the button, besides what we're seeing in the that example that I just showed. So to get started, we'll go ahead and create a new JavaFX application. Go ahead and click Next. So for this one, considering the fact that this is going to be for being able to set an image by the end of this, given the kind of behavior that I'm going to be adding to it, the way that I'm going to approach this, I'm going to call the project my image library. So even though I'm going to do this with just 2 images, if you imagine this in a more expanded way with kind of scaled up to include many images, you could kind of think of it like an image library. So we'll go ahead and finish this. So we'll get our default code at the beginning. We'll go ahead and clean this up. Remove this comment at the top. In this case, and now we've got a couple more classes that we want to go ahead and keep. So a few of these image imports are going to stay now. So we're going to keep the action event and event handler. You'll notice that both of these classes come from this event package. So we're going to be using both of those for the event handler that we have to make. We've also got our button right here. So just like our label, this is going to come from that control package. So for right now, the only other thing I need to go ahead and import is going to be that label. So we're going to go ahead and do javafx.scene.control.label. So we'll need that. We'll then come over here and modify the body of our image library class. Remove a few extra comments that we're not going to need. Go ahead and move this main method up to the top of the application. And then we'll go ahead and add some code for our start method. So the first part that we're going to go ahead and do is just create a label and then set it up so that we can change the text inside of that label. So we'll start off. So this label, we'll go ahead and call this, let's call this our name label, since I'm going to use this to hold the name of the images that I'm displaying. I'll say this is equal to a new label. And to start off with, for the very first image, we'll go ahead and put in the name Blue Bonnets. The next thing we'll go ahead and do is create our button. So for this button, we're going to use this. We'll call this set. For now, we'll go ahead and call it set label, and I'll change the name of that as we go. So this button, set label, is equal to a new button. And right here, we'll go ahead and say change image. And again, let's see, starting off, change label actually. And again, just like with the name of the button, the content, the text that's inside of that button, we'll go ahead and change that as we go as well. The next thing we're going to go ahead and do is create a VBox. So now that I think about it, we'll need a VBox container as well to hold our label and button. So do javafx.scene.layout.vbox. Go ahead and import this as well. And then right here, we'll go ahead and make that VBox. For this one, I'll just call it VBox, just in all lowercase. This will be equal to a new VBox. We'll go ahead and let's do about 10 pixels of spacing between them. This will be for our name label and our set label. And save that. The next thing we'll go ahead and do is create our scene. I'll call this scene in all lowercase. This will be equal to a new scene. We'll have that VBox be the root node of this scene. For right now, let's start off, since we only have a button and a label, just do 300 by 300. And then we'll go ahead and set up the stage. So we'll do primary stage dot set scene. Put in our scene object. We'll do primary stage dot set title. We'll call this, let's say, image library. And then finally, we'll go ahead and make sure this is actually displaying. Save that. Alright, so we'll go ahead and run this once. We'll probably have to make a little bit of a modification to the way that the content is being displayed. For starters, I'll probably end up wanting to align this in the center. But we'll go ahead and look at this now just to see how everything is looking. So we've now got our label right here, and then that change label button right underneath it. So right now, if I were to click this button, we'll see that nothing happens because I've not given it an event handler yet. So as of right now, my program doesn't really know what to do with this. It basically is working under the assumption that I don't want to do anything with it because I haven't told it to do anything with it. We can also see, since the title doesn't quite fit, that maybe we do want to make this a little bit wider than 300. So let's go ahead and make a couple of modifications and also go ahead and start adding the event handler for this. Let's go ahead and do one more import for the pause class. So we'll get some geometry. The pause. So we're going to use this to go ahead and set up that center alignment for our VBox. So right here, we'll do VBox.setAlignment. And then we'll go ahead and do pause.center. For the width right here, we're going to set this to 350. And now that we've got all that, now we'll go ahead and start working on the implementation of our event handler. So the way that the event handler is going to work is I'm actually going to create another class. So we saw the event handler, whatever we create, it's going to be another class. And I'm going to put that inside of this image library class. So that's going to be contained in the body of image library, meaning that it's still going to be within this pair of curly braces right here. So right here, we're going to go ahead and make this inner class. I will tell you now, we want to go ahead and make sure that this is private. So you can kind of think of it like a field for this class. So for certain reasons, we're going to go ahead and set this to private. Eventually, I'll go into more detail about this idea of inner classes and explain more precisely why it is that we want to go about making these private. For now, you'll just have to trust me that this is the best practice for this. So we're going to make this private. We will go ahead and give this private class. We'll go ahead and give this a name. So for this one, since this is going to be used to handle changing the label or eventually changing the image, if we take a look right here, so we've got something kind of like just generic called button click handler for this example that I did here. So for this one, we'll go ahead and just say something like, let's say change handler. So this is basically my handler for when I want to change my label and my image. So just give it a name kind of like that. We're going to go ahead and say this implements our event handler, and this will specifically be for action events. We'll then go ahead and create the body for this. So most likely this error right now is complaining about the fact that we have not yet implemented that method handle. So that handle method that we've got in our event handler. So we'll go ahead and do public void handle. And then right here, we'll go ahead and give it our event. So it's going to be action event. And then inside of here, what we want to go ahead and do is whenever the user clicks the button, what we want to do is essentially check to see what the current contents of this label happen to be, so that then we know what we want to change the contents to. Because if we click this button to change it from this to some other name, we want to make sure that, if it's already been changed to the other name and we click the button again, that it can change back. So it needs to kind of keep track of what the, essentially what we could say is the current state of this label. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and include an if statement right here. So we're going to say if we'll do, it's a name label dot get text. So we're going to go ahead and get the text of our name label, and we're going to check to see if that is equal to, so say dot equals, and then we're going to check, did I call it name label? Yes. We're going to check to see if that is equal to bluebonnets. And at this point, we'll get a slight error, and the reason for that, if we double check right here, is because of the fact that it doesn't recognize this variable name label. The problem that we're running into right now is that I've created this private class. This is going to be separate from my start method, so these are kind of broken apart from each other. So the problem that I'm running into is that name label isn't recognized in the scope of my change handler private class. So to fix that, I need to make sure that this name label is in a particular scope where it can be seen by both the start method and my event handler. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just take this label. I'm just going to go ahead and cut that and take that out of there. And we're going to go ahead and move that up to the top of the class right here so that it can just go ahead and be a field of the class. And then in addition to that, since this is going to be a field for this image library class now, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that it's private to keep it secure. Go ahead and save that. And now by doing that, it can be seen by both the start method and also by my change handler class. So we'll go ahead and do this check. And whenever we do this check, we can then go ahead and say, okay, if it's equal to bluebonnets right now, let's go ahead and change it to something else. Otherwise, if it's equal to whatever that something else happens to be, then we'll go ahead and say name label dot set text, and we'll change that back to bluebonnets. So then the question is, what are we going to change it to if it is currently equal to bluebonnets? Well, since I'm doing one of these as a flower, I figure the other image, we'll go ahead and just do another flower. So for this one, we're going to go ahead and do name label dot set text. And for the other flower, we're going to go ahead and do a chrysanthemum. So we'll do chrysanthemum. Okay. Alright, so go ahead and save that. And so now that we've got all this set up, you might think that we are ready to go to start using this, but there is still one particular problem with this. So we've got our event handler that's saying, okay, whenever we have this particular kind of event going on, we want to do this little change between one label's text versus another. The problem, though, is how do we know precisely which button is supposed to handle this particular type of event? So in this case, it might seem obvious because we have just one button in the application, so naturally that must be the only button that this should apply to. But try to imagine having an application with maybe a dozen different buttons. How do you know which one of those dozen buttons this particular event handler is actually meant to handle some actions for? So if we come over here, we can go ahead and take a look at one more aspect of setting up our event handler. So after we've written that event handler, we need to have some kind of connection between the event handler and the button. So we need to make sure that we understand which button that event needs to be handled with. So we're going to register an event. That's going to be the process of connecting the actual button control to that event handler. So you can see right here, we've got some button called myButton. We're going to call a particular method on myButton. It's going to be that setOnAction method. And inside of that setOnAction method, the thing that we're passing in is going to be a new object of our event handler class. So an event handler, also known as an event listener class, as we can see with the way that we've approached this, it's going to be written as a private inner class. In a moment, after I've kind of gone through a few different configurations for the functionality of this event handler, we'll take a look at two other approaches. So we're also going to be looking at anonymous inner classes and lambda expressions. So I'm going to go through essentially how to do each one of those within this concept of button controls and events. Eventually, I will come back to both of those concepts to go into more detail about the exact syntax of each, but that'll come a fair bit later. So we'll go ahead and minimize this. Coming back over here. So now that we've already got our event handler, we want to go ahead and register it to that button. So right here is where we went ahead and made our button. So I'll just go ahead and add the event registration just underneath it. So we're going to say set label dot set on action. And inside of here, we're going to go ahead and say that we want a new, and it's going to be this change handler. So we're going to do a new change handler, and we'll be calling the constructor for that object. So go ahead and save that. And now if we go ahead and run this, so we've got our label, it says Bluebonnets. We're going to click this change label button, and when we do that, it's going to change it to say chrysanthemum. And now, because of the way that I set up the code in our event handler, if I click it again, it'll change it back to Bluebonnets. So if you just keep clicking that, you can keep alternating between those two different labels. So now that we've got this, now I want to go ahead and add a little bit more to this. So the next thing I want to go ahead and introduce is going to be the images that I want to display along with those labels. So I actually have those images ready to go already right here. So we're going to go ahead and grab these two images. So I'm going to go ahead and get both of those. Go ahead and minimize this. I then want to go ahead and add this to the project itself. So I'm going to go ahead and just open up the project. So navigate over to my NetBeans projects. I'm going to locate my image library, and then inside of this project directory, I'm just going to go ahead and make a new folder. And we're going to call it images, and then open up that folder, and inside of there I'm going to put in my two images. Go ahead and we'll go ahead and minimize this for now. I'm going to need it for one more image a little bit later, but for right now we've got those two. Now that we've got those images, we also need to make sure that we're importing the proper classes to be able to use them. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce two more import statements right here. So the first one is going to be for image itself. So this will be the one to actually load those images into our program. And then the other one's going to be for the image view, so that we can actually display those images that we're loading. The next thing I want to go ahead and do, since I'm going to be using these images and this image view between both the start method for whatever my initial content is, as well as in the inside of this change handler, whenever I need to swap between the two images, it's basically going to be the same issue that I'm having with name label. I have two different scopes that I want to go ahead and use these images and this image view in. So to kind of simplify the process, I'm just going to go ahead and make these all fields of this class as well. So I'm going to do private image. So the first one's going to be Bluebonnets. So I'm just going to do BB, keep that short. So this will be my BB image. This will be equal to a new image. And this is coming from that file. So we're going to use the file protocol. This is going to be in the images folder. And then it's specifically going to be bluebonnets.jpg. The next one is going to be private image. For this one, I'll also go ahead and shorthand it. I'm just going to do crisp, so just CHRYS for short image. This will be equal to a new image. This is going to be, again, that file protocol. It's going to be images/chrysanthemum.jpg. And then to double check to make sure that everything is correct, we'll go over to Files, Images. You can see both of those there, and see that everything is matching up. Yeah, one more thing is to make sure that the extension is correct. So this would be PNG for Bluebonnets. Go ahead and save that. And then the last thing I'll go ahead and do is just create my image view. So I'll have private image view. This is just going to be, we'll say flower IV, since this one's going to be either one of these depending on the current state. Say this is equal to a new image view. And initially, when we first run the application, it's going to be this blue bonded image. So we'll go ahead and put that there. Save that. Coming down here, I did say that we were going to go ahead and change our label, or our button set label. So instead, now I'm going to go ahead and call this set content, since now it's going to be used to change both the label and the image. And we'll also go ahead and change this to say change content. And we'll go ahead and update any other situation where we're using that name. So we're going to say set content here, and then also set content here. Go ahead and save that. The next thing we'll go ahead and do, since we're going to go ahead and display this image, we can go ahead and put that here inside of our VBox. So we know that we're going to have our image. We want to go ahead and put that at the very top, with the label underneath it, and then the button at the bottom. So we'll go ahead and do flower IV right here. Additionally, I want to go ahead and modify the dimensions of it. So for that, I'll go ahead and just do that underneath the part of the code where I'm setting up my button. So right here, we'll go ahead and grab our image view, and we'll say set preserve ratio to true. And then let's see, we'll go ahead and set the height. And for the height, let's go ahead and set this to something like, let's start off with something like, say, 200 for the height. And if necessary, I'll go ahead and modify that to come up with a height that's a bit more reasonable for each of them. We'll also go ahead and make this a little bit taller and a little bit wider. So we'll go ahead and change the dimensions of the scene to be 500 for the width and then 400 for the height. That should be large enough for the image to display as well now. But if it's not, then again, we can go ahead and modify that in a moment. And then finally, getting back into the change handler. So we can still go ahead and just get the text and determine which one of the pieces of content, so that image and label that we're currently displaying, based on whatever our label's contents currently happen to be. So in addition to setting the text of the label, we can then also go ahead and set the image for our image view. So we can go ahead and actually use that set image method now to swap between the two different images that we're working with. So after setting the label, we'll go ahead and grab our flower image view. We'll do set image. And right here, if we do the chrysanthemum, we want to go ahead and change this to our Chris image. And right here, when we switch back to bluebonnets, we want to go ahead and set this back to the BB image. Go ahead and save that. And now if we run this, whenever we click the button, now it's going to change both the image and the text of our label. So we'll go ahead and take a look at this, see if everything's fitting in our application properly. It looks like it actually fit perfectly. It looks like I actually got exactly the right dimensions for that. That is very lucky. So we've got our image right here for our bluebonnets. If we go ahead and click change content, then it will go ahead and swap it to the chrysanthemum, and it will also go ahead and change that image. So we can actually see all of this content changing every time we click that button now. Alright, so now that we've done all this, we'll go ahead and close this. We'll come back over here for a moment. So another thing that I'll talk briefly about, won't worry too much about including this with our program, but one other thing that I want to address is that I mentioned before that whenever a particular event occurs, a particular control will generate a source for that event. So whatever control you say, for example, if you click a button, the button that you clicked is going to be the source of your event. So there's actually going to be a method that you could use, this getSource method. You can use that to return the source of an action event. So that's going to be used to determine which particular button control was clicked. So this is very useful in applications where maybe you have a whole bunch of buttons, but you want to do pretty much the same thing with each of those buttons, but it really kind of depends on precisely which one was clicked. So what you could do is you can actually check to see exactly which button was clicked by just getting the source of the event that you're capturing. And then from there, you can include maybe some kind of conditional code like what we have right here. So if you look in the body of this handle method, you'll see if event.getSource, if that address matches the address for our button object. So I'm actually using the equality operator. So if that reference matches with that particular source, then we can go ahead and just do, maybe in this case, just a quick print statement to see that that particular button was clicked. So this is just another useful piece of code that you can include for applications that involve many different buttons. Alright, so getting into something that we're going to be using with our particular application. So we're going to take a look at text field controls and how we go about reading input from the user. So text fields are going to be used in GUIs to get some kind of user input. In order to capture the input that was entered into a text field control, we're going to use the getText method. So we can see here that we've created some kind of text field. We could start off, if you see in the constructor for text field, we've said please enter text here. Anything that you put for that constructor is just some default text that will be included when you first run the application. The expectation usually is that the user is just going to remove that placeholder text and just put in their own. We can also include another string, so we can go ahead and initialize a string for input, and then maybe later when we actually get the text from that text field, we can just go ahead and store it in that input string, so then we can go ahead and start processing it in a pretty quick, easy manner. But in this particular case, when it comes to that processing, there's only really one thing I'm going to need to do with it. I'm just going to need to be able to compare it to those different string literals that we've included, so like the bluebonnets and that chrysanthemum, to be able to determine which image we want to display based on whatever the user types into a text field. So let's go ahead and minimize this. We'll go back over to NetBeans. And so for this next part, I'm going to go ahead and start modifying quite a few things. So in particular, what I need to go ahead and do is add one more control. So this will be the last one that I need for this application. It's going to be a text field. So we're going to do import JavaFX.scene.control. So the text field, just like the label and the button, will come from that control package. So we're going to go ahead and use a text field. Since I need to go ahead and put that into the scene, so it's going to go through the start method, and I also need to be able to get the text from it in my change handler, so inside of that event handler class. Again, just like with my labels, with my label, my images, and my image view, this is going to be something that is handled in two different scopes in this application. So this will be yet another thing that I need to create a field for right here. So we'll go ahead and say private text field. We'll go ahead and call this one just user search. So this is basically just them inputting whatever it is that they're going to be looking for. So we'll go ahead and say this is equal to a new text field. And we can go ahead and use that placeholder, kind of like what we have right here. So say please enter text here. Go ahead and save that. We will then come down to our VBox. So we've got our image and the title, the label for that image. We will then go ahead and add our text field right here, and then we'll still have that button at the very bottom. So the text field is going to be that user search. So go ahead and put that here. I think based on the way that the content was displaying before, that 400 should still be tall enough to account for all 4 of these elements in our VBox. And then the last thing I need to do is come down here, and instead of checking the label to see if we should just swap between 2 different images, instead now what I'm going to be using is going to be my user search. That's going to be that text field. So we'll go ahead and change that, and then based on what they put there, then we'll go ahead and update this. The other thing I need to go ahead and do is now, because of the fact that what we want to do is display content based on what the user is searching for, we're not going to be swapping between them, but instead, whatever this user search is equal to, that's what we need to actually display. So we also need to go ahead and actually kind of flip these two to say switch this to right here, and go ahead and switch this to right here. We'll go ahead and save that. And so now if the user types in bluebonnets, we'll go ahead and display the bluebonnets image. We'll also set the label to be bluebonnets. For this one, what we want to go ahead and say is if they type in, so say else if, this user search.getText.equals, and then we want to do chrysanthemum. Go ahead and put that there. A couple of other things I want to go ahead and do with this. So to kind of take into consideration ease of use with this, I'm going to go ahead and modify a few more things. For example, it might not necessarily be the case that the user will always capitalize these B's. Additionally, they probably won't capitalize the C in chrysanthemum either. So to account for that, instead of just using the equals method, I'm going to use equals ignore case for both of these. That way then I can just go ahead and just disregard any capitalization. It won't matter anymore. The other thing I'm going to go ahead and throw in, mostly because this just kind of makes sense to me, I suspect that most people will probably not spell chrysanthemum correctly. It's just one of those words that is pretty easy to misspell. So to go ahead and make that a little bit easier, I'm going to go ahead and actually include 2 different cases that would allow them to navigate to that image. So we'll go ahead and copy this twice. In between here, we're going to go ahead and do a logical OR. So it could be one entry or the other. So do that. To also go ahead and make sure this fits, I'm just going to move this to the next line. So we're just going to do essentially all of this as our conditional for this else if. And right here, I'm going to go ahead and reduce this down to just Chris. So just use that shorthand that I had before. And hopefully that'll make it a little bit easier for people to spell that correctly. So we'll go ahead and save it like this, and we'll run it. There's going to be one additional case that I want to account for. We'll go ahead and add that in a moment, and then kind of wrap up on this first approach to writing out our event handler. So go ahead and run this. So now we've got our text field right here. By default, we start off with the bluebonnets. We have this whole image. So if I go ahead and type in bluebonnets right here, I click change content, we'll see that nothing happens. Instead, I go ahead and type in chrysanthemum. So let's go ahead and type out the entire word. We can go ahead and change it to the chrysanthemum picture. If I go ahead and remove most of this, we'll go ahead and test it with just Chris as well. See that it goes ahead and stays the same. We can also test it by just changing back and forth. So we can go back to bluebonnets, and then go back to just Chris. And get that as well. Okay. So this looks all good. There is, of course, one problem, which is that if the user types in something that we don't actually have, say maybe they type in, let's try another flower, say they type in rose, we click change content. Right now it doesn't do anything, so it doesn't really give any indication that this is something we can't find. So I want to go ahead and include one more case for this. So I'm going to say another else right here. We want to go ahead and include one more image that we're going to go ahead and set this to. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and come back over here. So coming over to these images that I had, just ready to go. I've got this error that I want to include as well. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that. And then I'm going to come over to my images folder in my NetBeans project. So go ahead and paste that right there. We'll then go ahead and close this now, since I won't need that anymore. And also close that. Coming up here. So right here, I've included my different images. So underneath my Chris image, I'm going to do one more private image. And this is going to be for my error image. It's equal to a new image. Again, we're going to use the file protocol. It's come from the images folder, and it's going to be error.jpg. And then back down here, if the user enters something that doesn't exist or they misspell one of these names, we'll go ahead and set our flower image view to the error image. Go ahead and save that. And then finally, if we run this, so if we go ahead and try something that doesn't exist again, so say something like rose, and click change content, and now we'll just go ahead and get this little error message that I set up. So it would be kind of like a 404 error. In most senses, you'd think of that as page doesn't exist. In this case, we might describe that as this content doesn't exist. Additionally, we should probably go ahead and modify the label. So go ahead and close that, and right here, we'll also go ahead and say our name label, that's set text, and say content not found. Save that, and if we go ahead and run this one more time just to check that as well, again just typing in rows, I'm going to see content not found and also our error message. Alright, so this is going to wrap up everything for this first implementation of our event handler, this button. Going into the next video, I want to go ahead and take a look at essentially the other half of event handling by also looking at the anonymous inner class and the Lambda expression for implementing this event handler.